interesting, fascinating, and at the same time educational, inspirational, and motivational. Wow, that's great. So you know what I was just listening to? I was listening to a podcast, but not just any podcast. I was listening to our podcast. And recently we've got some questions about how to access and listen to our podcast. So today I want to talk about what a podcast is, why you might want to listen to a podcast, and why you definitely want to listen to our podcast. Then I'm going to show you how to access podcasts through a PC and also a smartphone. So let's begin. All right, so a podcast is basically a digital audio file that's available on the internet for download. You can download it to your PC or your smartphone. If you do it to your smartphone, it's typically going to be through a podcast player. When you're in the podcast, you can listen to any episode that you want. When you subscribe or follow a podcast, then you get new episodes as they're released. Now, some podcasts prefer that you listen to their episodes in chronological order from the beginning all the way through, and then some release their episodes, and so what you see in your feed are the latest episodes. Now, we prefer for people to start at the beginning and work their way through because we cover a lot of great, useful initial preliminary information like our values and mission and the basics of real food and some other supportive information, but you can listen to it in any way that you want. All right, now, why listen to a podcast? I think the biggest reason for most of us is convenience. A lot of us prefer to consume our content through audio versus sitting and actually watching a video. Although a lot of videos have useful images and documents and graphs and things that support what's being said, I think it's much more convenient for a lot of us to just listen to what's being said and we still get the main gist of what's being said. So a lot of content creators will create a video and then export the audio and make a podcast out of it. And some content creators just make a podcast and they don't even shoot a video with it. So I think the biggest thing is convenience. So imagine being able to listen to some useful information as you're on a walk, as you're on a long drive, as you're cleaning the house or prepping dinner. It's very convenient and it allows you to get some useful information, get inspired and motivated and engaged without having to sit down and actually watch a video. Now, why listen to our podcast specifically? Well, remember what it is that we're doing. We're here bringing clarity and confidence to the people that we work with. And so the vision for our podcast is to constantly be in your ear so that we're reinforcing health concepts that you may have heard maybe one time. And we all know that it helps and benefits us to hear things more than once. We're also keeping you up to date on the latest and greatest of what we got going on, the latest and greatest of the holistic health leaders and hotshots that we follow. We're also announcing seminars, programs, progressions, updates, and it's a great way to just stay involved, get re-inspired, re-motivated, and re-engaged, especially if you've fallen off. And remember that constant learning and constant involvement equals constant progress. Just imagine being able to listen to really useful, empowering, educational information in little pockets throughout the day as you're going about your day. You can't help but continue to make beneficial changes in your life. So what I'd like to do now is show you how to access podcasts from a PC, and then we'll transition over to accessing a podcast through a smartphone. All right, cool. So if you're on a computer, you can simply visit SuperHumanTransformation.com, which is our public website, and you'll notice at the top of the menu there's a podcast button. And if you click on that, you'll go to our podcast website. Now you can also just go directly to podcast.superhumantransformation.com. And what you'll see there is every episode that we put out. There's a player, so you can actually play from the player inside this web page. You can also download the episode as an MP3 or share it through different social media platforms. Now what's cool about this is as it's playing, you can exit out of this and go to different websites and do other things, and it's not gonna stop the playing of the episode. Now another great place, if you're on a Mac, you can download Apple Podcast, and in Apple Podcast, you can simply search for We Are the SHT, and then once you do that, you should see a show that is called We Are the SHT. Now once you see this show, I'd recommend clicking follow so that you get notified of the latest and greatest. And then once you're inside the podcast, of course, you can scroll through and you can listen to any episode that you want. Another great option from a PC is going to be Google Podcasts. So if you just go to Google Podcasts and then you search for We Are the SHT, we see it right here. You can subscribe to it. and you can also scroll through all the different episodes that we have. Super popular is going to be Spotify. So if I come into Spotify and I search for We Are the SHT, then I should see podcast, and then I can subscribe to it by following it, and I can also go through and listen to any episode that I want. And then the final place that I'd recommend looking at is going to be Prime Music. So if you go to music.amazon.com, same thing, go into the search bar and type We Are the SHT, and we should see somewhere in here the podcast We Are the SHT. And again, I can follow, I can go through and listen to any episode that I want. So you've got several different options there. One of the most convenient, I think, is going to podcast.superhumantransformation.com. So now let's transition over to a smartphone and see what that looks like from a smartphone. So I'm using an iPhone right now. And if I go into a web browser, I can find that same podcast page, which is podcast.superhumantransformation.com. And then I have the same options here. I can play any episode that I want. And again, what's really cool about this is once I hit play, I can come out of this web browser and do other things on my phone, and it's still going to play in my ear. Now, what might be more beneficial from a smartphone would be to use an actual podcast player. So if you're on an iPhone, you can use Apple Podcast. And Apple Podcasts, once you're in the application, most iPhones are going to have this downloaded already, but you can go to the App Store and download it. Then I can search for the podcast We Are the SHT, and I should pull up the show We Are the SHT. And then I can subscribe and follow. I can listen to any episode that I want. All right, something else that you might want to consider would be Google Podcast. And so I would just need to go to the App Store and search for Google Podcast. And then I see it right here. Once I have it downloaded, once I'm in Google Podcast, then same thing. I can search for We Are the SHT. And there we have it. You can subscribe, you can listen to any episode that you want. All right, we also mentioned before Spotify. Spotify has a dedicated application. If I go into Spotify, I can also search for We Are the SHT. And there we have it. I can make sure that I'm following it, and I can listen to any episode that I want. And then finally, something to consider would be Amazon Music. So same thing, when I come into Amazon Music, I can search for We Are the SHT, and then I should find a podcast eventually. Here we are. I can make sure that I'm following it, and I can listen to any episode that I want. All right, so there you have it. We talked about what a podcast is, why you might want to listen to a podcast. I think the biggest reason for most of us is convenience. We talked about why you definitely want to listen to our podcast, and we showed you how to access it through a PC. I think the easiest way to listen to ours through a PC is podcast.superhumantransformation.com. If you're on a Mac, you can listen to it through Apple Podcast. If you're on another kind of computer, you can do Google Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music. Or the easiest way to listen to a podcast is through a smartphone and a podcast player. Now again, remember, on the smartphone, you can go to podcast.superhumantransformation.com in any browser. But if you download a podcast player, I would recommend for iPhone users, Apple Podcast. For Android users, maybe Google Podcast, or use Spotify or Amazon Music, or you can experiment with some of the other players, okay? Now, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, snide remarks, send them our way. And when you listen to it and you enjoy it, please leave us a rating and review, especially on Apple Podcasts, because that helps our rankings and it helps us empower other people together, okay? We will talk to you guys soon.